Without objection.
Call. And I ask consent to divide equally the remaining amount of morning business time.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the senator from New York and I are on the floor today to introduce legislation, which he will do in just a moment, that will help to make the Senate a more effective place to deal with the big issues facing our country, such as the debt and our national defense and other issues. This is the result of discussions that we have had over the last several months with many members of the Senate on both sides of the aisle. It began with some reforms in the Senate rules, which included eliminating the secret hold, so-called, and doing other steps. And it's the culmination of work by a number of senators on both sides of the aisle, including Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins, the leaders, Senator Reid and Senator McConnell, when they were whips, Senator Schumer and I and others, bipartisan breakfast, which we've had a couple of years ago. And it came down to the question, how many confirmations should the Senate have? How many confirmations are enough confirmations? Is it in the public interest to allow a new president, whether Democratic or Republican, to staff the government promptly? And is it in the public interest to get rid of this syndrome which is established in Washington, which I call innocent until nominated, where we invite a distinguished person to come in and run through a gauntlet that makes him or her out to be a criminal for making some mistake in the process of being confirmed. So we've worked together on that, and we've come up with legislation that Senator Schumer will introduce on behalf of both of us, on behalf of the leaders, Senator Reid and Senator McConnell, and on behalf of Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins. This legislation would answer the question, how many confirmations are enough confirmations, by reducing the number by dealing with from about 1,400 to 1,000. Just to put that into perspective, that's still more confirmations than existed when President Clinton was President of the United States. It's 4 times as many confirmations as existed when President Kennedy was President of the United States. In other words, like many things in government, the number of confirmations has grown over time, and we've ended up confirming people we have no business confirming, people who are PR officers, people who are financial information people, and we've made it difficult for the government to be staffed. Is it in our interest, those citizens, to staff the government promptly? Yes, I think it is. We've created this phenomenon where for example, when President Obama came in, Secretary Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, was sitting over there almost home alone during the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression. According to news accounts, he didn't have much help. The key vacant positions were Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, these are all in Treasury, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Trade and Tariff Policy, and a variety of others. That wasn't helping any of us, whether we agreed or not with President Obama or Secretary Geithner. At least after an election, a president should be able to promptly staff the government, and we in the Senate should have procedures that give us a chance to review those nominees and offer our advice and consent and confirm or reject those nominees in a reasonable period of time. If we're spending our time dealing with junior officials or PR officers, we're spending less time dealing with the Assistant Secretary of Tax Policy, on whom we should be focusing a lot of time and to whom we should be asking a lot of questions. And then this business of what I call innocent until nominated. All of us know that this exists. And it really exists sloppiness on our part, both in the legislative branch and the executive branch. If you're asked to serve in the federal government, and I know this because I was asked by the first President Bush, you fill out forms. Well, there are many forms. There are many forms in the executive branch. They have different definitions of, for example, income. So if you were to carelessly fill out the same definition of income in this form as another form, you might have been incorrect on one of the forms. And then someone might say you were telling a lie and weren't fit to serve. That's been caused by others, and including me, as being innocent until nominated. I remember when Ron Kirk was nominated by President Obama, the former mayor of Dallas, to be the trade representative. There was some issue about whether he had properly reported a charitable contribution, a speech fee that he gave to charity. Well, what difference did it make in terms of his overall fitness to serve? It held him up, it embarrassed him. It was not relevant to the inquiry. So the legislation that we have will do the following. It will take 400 positions. Half of them will be eliminated as Senate confirmations. These are the ones we don't need to spend time on. The other half will come directly to the desk, and unless an individual senator says send it on to committee, it'll be expedited. That still leaves us with 1,000 Senate confirmations that we can have, 1,000 hostages that we can take. That's more hostages than we could take under Bill Clinton. That's more hostages than the Senate could take, 4 times as many under President Kennedy. That ought to be plenty of hostages for any senator to make his or her point if that's what we seek to do. And then the second thing it would do is set up a process whereby an executive branch commission would review the various forms that nominees are expected to fill out, try to have a single smart form in the executive branch, consult with the committees of Congress to see if we can do the same thing with our forms, and make it possible that we can get all the information we want without unnecessarily subjecting nominees to harassment or trickery just because they're not wise enough to fill out different forms with different definitions. I think it's a substantial step forward. May not sound like much to those watching the United States Senate, but let me just say that both of our leaders, Reid and McConnell, have said they tried and couldn't get it done. Senator McConnell, Senator Lieberman, and Senator Collins have tried and they couldn't get it done. I worked with Senator Lieberman 2 years ago. We couldn't get it done. What has happened this time is that as a result of the discussion we had earlier in the year about making the Senate a more effective place to work, with the full support of the leaders, Reid and McConnell, with the full support of Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins, and with the good work of Senator Schumer, we've come up with a consensus piece of legislation which has broad bipartisan support, both sides of the aisle, including many chairmen and ranking members of the committee who you would think might be the first ones to object, still leaves the Senate with the prerogatives it ought to have in terms of reviewing presidential nominees, and separates out those who take our time away from the more important things that we ought to be doing. I want to thank the senator from New York for the way he's worked on this. He's been constructive and direct and helpful. I thank the leaders for their support. I hope that the committees will rapidly consider the legislation that Senator Schumer will offer on our behalf, and I hope that it will show that we can take another small step in making the Senate a more effective place to work. I ask consent to include following my remarks, remarks that I made earlier on this subject, and prior to that, I'd like to list the presidential appointments no longer requiring Senate confirmation. There are about 200 of those, and privileged nominations, those are the ones that will be expedited unless a single senator decides that he or she wants to have this nominee sent to the committee, and that's about another 200. I thank the president, and I notice that the senator from New York is also on the floor, and I thank him for his work on this.
Mr. President.
Senator from New York.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank my colleague from Tennessee. He's been a great partner in this. In fact, I would say it was his impetus that brought us here. He had thought about this long and hard, had worked